In this episode, we're going to turn exam day from a vague, stressful event into a set of simple moves you can repeat calmly from the first question to the last. The CGRC exam is not designed to reward panic studying or clever guessing, because it is built to measure whether you can think like someone who understands governance, risk, and compliance as a connected system. That means the best exam day tactics are not magic tricks, and they are not about trying to outsmart the test, but about applying a stable mental model, managing your time with intention, and eliminating wrong answers efficiently. Beginners often walk into certification exams expecting that knowing facts will be enough, and then they get rattled when multiple choices sound plausible. The good news is that this kind of exam becomes much easier when you have a repeatable decision process you trust. So we'll focus on the 3 skills that matter most under pressure: how to frame each question, how to pace without rushing, and how to narrow options without falling for distractors. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CyberAuthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A mental model is basically a small set of rules your brain uses to make sense of a situation quickly. For CGRC-style questions, a reliable mental model is to think in terms of purpose, scope, control, and evidence. Purpose asks what the organization is trying to achieve and why the requirement exists, because governance is always tied to objectives and integrity. Scope asks what system, process, or boundary the question actually applies to, because so many wrong answers are wrong only because they reach beyond what the scenario describes. Control asks what type of safeguard or requirement would address the situation at the right level, such as policy intent versus technical detail, because the exam often tests whether you pick the appropriate layer. Evidence asks what would prove compliance or prove that a control is working, because governance without verification is just wishful thinking. If you carry those 4 ideas into every question, you stop feeling like you are guessing, because you are consistently asking the same good questions the exam expects you to ask. Another mental model that pairs well with CGRC questions is the idea of sequence, meaning what happens first, what happens next, and what happens later. Governance and compliance work tends to follow an order. Define what you are responsible for, decide what rules apply, select controls that meet those rules, and then monitor and document results. Many exam questions try to tempt you with a correct action that is simply out of order. For example, an option may suggest implementing a control when the scenario is still unclear about scope, ownership, or requirements. In real life, doing something out of order creates wasted effort, rework, and sometimes compliance gaps, so the exam treats sequence as a marker of maturity. When you read a question, ask yourself whether it is fundamentally a sequencing question, even if the word first is not present. If the scenario feels like something is missing, the correct answer is often the step that fills the missing prerequisite rather than the step that looks most impressive. Pacing is your next priority, because even a perfect mental model won't help if you run out of time or get stuck spiraling on a handful of questions. A healthy pacing approach starts with accepting that you will not feel 100% certain on every question, and that certainty is not the standard for moving on. Instead, the standard is whether you have applied your process, eliminated clearly wrong options, and selected the best remaining answer based on the scenario. Beginners often waste time rereading the same question repeatedly because they are searching for comfort, but comfort does not always arrive, especially when 2 options are close. A better approach is to decide on a reasonable time limit per question in your mind and treat it as a guardrail. If you are still stuck after you've done the key steps, you choose the best option and continue, because the exam is a long run, not a single perfect moment. Consistent forward motion is part of performance. One way to keep your pace steady is to treat the exam like a series of small sprints rather than one long marathon you cannot measure. Instead of watching the clock with anxiety, you can periodically check whether your progress roughly matches the remaining time. This is not about obsessing over seconds. It is about preventing a surprise time crisis near the end. If you notice you are moving too slowly, the correction is not to rush blindly, but to tighten your process. Read more carefully the first time, eliminate faster, and avoid overthinking. If you notice you are moving too fast, the correction is to slow down just enough to catch the small words that flip meaning, like best, primary, or most likely. Many exam mistakes are not content mistakes. They are reading mistakes. Pacing is really about balancing attention and speed so you can make good decisions repeatedly. Now let's get practical about elimination strategy, because elimination is the skill that turns a hard multiple-choice question into a manageable decision. The first elimination move is to remove answers that do not match the question's job. If the question is asking about governance intent, and an answer is a very specific technical implementation detail, that mismatch is a strong signal it is wrong. If the question is asking about what comes first, and an answer describes a later activity like auditing results, that mismatch is also a strong signal it is wrong. The second elimination move is to remove answers that are out of scope, meaning they address a broader system, a different authority, or an unrelated framework beyond what is described. Out-of-scope answers can sound sophisticated, which is why they work as distractors, but they fail the scope test. The third move is to remove answers that solve a different problem than the one the scenario actually presents, such as focusing on availability when the scenario is clearly about integrity or compliance evidence. When you eliminate this way, you often end up with two plausible answers, which is where your mental model finishes the job. When you are down to two plausible answers, you want a tiebreaker that is consistent with CGRC reasoning. One reliable tiebreaker is the principle of least assumption, meaning you prefer the answer that depends only on what the scenario states rather than adding extra imagined details. If one option assumes a major organizational change that the scenario never hints at, it is likely too heavy or premature. Another tiebreaker is role clarity, meaning you prefer the answer that assigns responsibility or establishes accountability when ownership is unclear. Governance often fails not because people don't know what to do, but because nobody is clearly responsible for doing it. A third tiebreaker is evidence orientation, meaning you prefer the answer that creates a measurable, documentable outcome over an answer that sounds good but produces no proof. Compliance is not a feeling, it is demonstrable. These tiebreakers keep you grounded in what governance and compliance are actually about, which is exactly what the exam is testing. Another common exam day challenge is how to handle long questions without getting mentally lost. Long questions are not always harder, but they carry more information, which increases the chance you miss something important. A helpful tactic is to read the last sentence first, because it usually tells you what is being asked, then read the scenario with that goal in mind. This prevents you from absorbing details without direction. As you read, look for constraint words that define the boundaries, like which system is involved, which stage of a process you are in, or what kind of requirement is driving the decision. You also want to notice whether the scenario describes a deficiency, like missing documentation, unclear scope, or inconsistent handling of data, because deficiencies usually point toward foundational governance fixes rather than advanced technical actions. By anchoring yourself to the ask and the constraints, you turn long questions into structured information instead of a wall of text. A big part of exam day performance is managing your mental state, and it matters because stress changes how your brain processes language and choices. When stress rises, people tend to either freeze and overthink or speed up and miss details, and both patterns reduce accuracy. A simple control is to use brief resets between questions, like a slow breath and a mental reminder of your model, purpose, scope, control, evidence. That takes only a moment, but it interrupts spiraling thoughts and returns you to process. Another control is to avoid trying to predict your score during the exam, because that self-monitoring consumes attention and often increases anxiety. Your job is not to evaluate yourself. Your job is to answer the next question well. If you notice frustration building, it can help to treat a difficult question as a normal part of the exam's design rather than as a sign you are failing. Difficulty is often distributed intentionally, and your task is to stay steady. Let's talk about guessing, because people pretend they won't guess, and then they guess anyway, so it's better to guess well. A good guess is not random. It is the result of elimination and alignment with the scenario's purpose. If you can eliminate two options confidently, you have already improved your odds, and you should not waste extra minutes chasing perfect certainty. If you cannot eliminate anything, that is usually a sign you have not identified the question's job or scope yet, so you go back and do that. rather than rereading the whole question in a loop. Another helpful tactic is to watch for absolute language in answers, because words like always or never often indicate overreach in governance contexts, where exceptions and context matter. That doesn't mean absolute language is always wrong, but it should trigger scrutiny. A well-executed guess is still a disciplined decision, and discipline adds up across an entire exam. Pacing and elimination also interact with how you handle questions that feel unfamiliar. Even if you studied well, you might see a term or scenario twist that you don't recognize, and that can cause panic. The best response is to shift from recall to reasoning, because the exam often provides enough context to make a sound decision even when a detail is unfamiliar. You return to your model and ask what the scenario is fundamentally about. Is it about defining scope, selecting a control type, assigning responsibility, or producing evidence? Then you evaluate the answer choices based on that fundamental purpose rather than on whether you recognize every term. Many wrong answers rely on intimidation, meaning they sound official, complex, or framework-heavy, and beginners choose them because they look advanced. But governance and compliance maturity often looks like clarity, sequence, and documentation, not complexity for its own sake. Reasoning keeps you from being bullied by unfamiliar details. Another exam day skill is knowing when to change your mind and when not to. If you revisit a question, the reason should be specific, like realizing you misread a keyword or noticing that one option violates scope. Changing your answer just because you feel uneasy is usually a mistake, because uneasiness is common even when your first choice was correct. A disciplined approach is to stick with your first answer unless you can articulate a concrete reason it is wrong. This protects you from second-guessing loops that waste time and reduce confidence. It also aligns with how governance decisions work in real life. You make the best decision you can with available information, document the rationale, and adjust when new information arrives. On the exam, the new information is usually a better reading of the question, not a new feeling. If you can't name the reason, keep the original answer and move on. As you approach the end of the exam, your tactics should focus on preserving accuracy while avoiding fatigue mistakes. Fatigue tends to make people stop reading carefully, and the final questions deserve the same attention as the first. This is where pacing earlier helps, because if you have managed your time well, you are not forced into frantic guessing at the end. A useful micro-tactic is to slow down slightly for the final stretch, because many people speed up due to relief, and that is when they miss the key word that flips the answer. You also want to keep your mental model active, because fatigue makes the brain default to superficial pattern matching, and superficial matching is exactly what distractors exploit. If you feel your attention dipping, a brief reset breath and a quick reminder of purpose and scope can restore focus surprisingly well. The finish line is not a place to relax. It is a place to execute cleanly. To bring it all together, exam day tactics for CGRC are really about running a stable process under time pressure. Your mental models keep your thinking consistent by focusing on purpose, scope, control, evidence, and sequence, which are the core patterns behind many questions. Your pacing keeps you from turning a few hard questions into a time crisis, and it protects your attention by preventing overthinking loops. Your elimination strategy turns multiple choice questions into manageable decisions by removing mismatched, out of scope, and misaligned options, then using tiebreakers like least assumption, role clarity, and evidence orientation. When stress shows up, you manage it with brief resets and a commitment to process rather than score prediction. That combination produces calm competence, which is what you want on exam day and what the credential is meant to represent. If you can consistently apply these tactics, you will feel less like you are taking a mysterious test and more like you are demonstrating a way of thinking you have already practiced.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.